When cleaners turn up at the tiger den of Bahawalpur Zoo, they get the shock of their lives. There, inside one of the tiger's mouths is a shoe. But who does it belong to? And how did it get there? Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying tiger attack on Mohammed Bilawal. Welcome to Final Affliction. Established in 1942, Bahawalpur Zoological Gardens are run by the Pakistani government. Set across 25 acres, the zoo is home to many different species of birds, as well as lots of different carnivores and predators. Visitors enjoy viewing jackals, civets, crocodiles, lions, hyenas, and tigers. The conditions in which the animals are housed are questionable, with standards dropping far below what would be considered ethical in many Western countries. But it was a popular tourist attraction and provided education on the various species in its care. On Wednesday, December 6, 2023, cleaners got the fright of their lives when they turned up at the tiger enclosure. They made their way around the perimeter fence and into the indoor dens at the back. Inside, they could see the 3 tigers, but there was something sticking out of one of the tiger's mouths. When the animal turned its head fully to look at the cleaning staff, they realized that it was a shoe. It was a worrying sight, but perhaps a visitor had tossed it into the enclosure. Moments later, they came across a gruesome discovery. Lying on the hard brown mud was a body. It wasn't moving and clearly had some serious injuries to its lower half. Immediately, emergency services were called and the zoo was shut down. But as the investigation got underway, what appeared to be an open and shut case turned out to be something of a mystery. The body belonged to that of 28-year-old Mohammed Bilawal from Greentown in Lahore. Given the condition of the body, it was assumed that he had died the previous evening. His father, Dr. Mohammed Javed, was informed of the terrible tragedy and began to make his way to Bahawalpur, more than 250 miles away from his home in Lahore. As investigators turned up at the site, the tigers were locked away in a secure section of the enclosure. Mohammed's body was badly mauled at the legs. It appeared that he had died from blood loss, and as news of the death got out, there was speculation. Rumors spread claiming that Mohammed was a drug addict and that he had altercations with law enforcement multiple times before. The media painted a picture of a disturbed young man and described him as a lunatic who had clearly jumped into the tiger enclosure. The zoo blamed the victim for the tragedy, stating that he had forced his way into the zoo, likely over an external wall, and had then climbed onto the top of the tiger house before jumping down onto the ground. If he was, then maybe he was hallucinating or was exceptionally bold, believing that he could take on not 1 but 3 Bengal tigers by himself. Having an intruder in their enclosure immediately triggered an attack for the tigers. They typically leap onto their prey using their weight and powerful front legs to bring it to the ground. After delivering a fatal bite to the neck and subduing their prey, they can then eat at their leisure. No information has been published regarding the nature of Mohammed's death. Only mention of his severely mauled legs made the press, suggesting that he died from blood loss rather than asphyxiation. But when Mohammed's father, Dr. Mohammed Javed, heard the rumors flying around about his son, he spoke out. The media had reported that he himself had claimed that Mohammed was a drug addict, but Mohammed's father had never said any of that. Somebody else had made up the story, probably in an attempt to protect the zoo from taking the blame for the incident. When interviewed over the telephone by the Express Tribune newspaper, Dr. Javed denied ever speaking to any media outlet since his son's death. Instead of the claims circulating in the local and national newspapers, he claimed that his son was a bright young man who was never addicted to and who was never in trouble with the law. Another false allegation was that he had identified his son's body. The news reported that he had arrived at the scene and declared that the deceased was indeed Mohammed. But again, that was a blatant lie, as Dr. Javed had not yet arrived at the location when these claims were made. The identification came from an ID card found by zoo staff inside one of Muhammad's pockets. If Muhammad wasn't the lunatic the media and local government made him out to be, then what was he doing inside the zoo after closing time? And how did he get into the tiger enclosure? Zoo staff and lead investigators scoured CCTV footage of the zoo, but there was no evidence of Muhammad on the screens. They couldn't tell how he had even entered the zoo, let alone the tiger enclosure. Investigators needed to determine whether the zoo was at fault or if this was an isolated incident from a determined and traumatized young man. It seemed the zoo were hell-bent on trying to protect themselves by ensuring people believed that Muhammad deliberately put himself in harm's way, and no amount of fencing or high walls were going to stop him. It transpired that Muhammad had a fight with one of the zoo wardens, and as such, the zoo staff made these claims about him. It was far easier to make him out to be unstable than to accept responsibility themselves. With the initial false accusations about Muhammad, the idea that he deliberately entered the tiger's enclosure was believable. But now, knowing that these were false allegations, something else must have happened. His father believed that he slipped from the roof of the tiger house, landing heavily into their enclosure. His fall didn't go unnoticed by the tigers, and they immediately ran at him. As they circled the man, they swiped with their paws as Muhammad tried to get to his feet. But every time he almost stood up, he was knocked back down again. Then one of the tigers grabbed his leg in its jaws, and the others bit him repeatedly. Muhammad would have put up a fight, kicking with his legs and trying to break free. His screams for help went unanswered as the zoo was locked up for the night. He knew he was in trouble. He knew this was the end. Bengal tigers have a bite force of more than 1,000 psi. They can weigh more than 250 kilograms, 550 pounds. With potentially 3 of them bearing down on Muhammad, he didn't stand a chance. Although they were captive animals, they still had their natural killing instinct deep within them. Lead investigators said that it was clear that Muhammad was alive when he entered the predator's enclosure. The fall from the roof had not killed him. They were certain that the tigers had, but they had not feasted on his body. Once he had succumbed to his injuries, they had walked away, satisfied that the threat was over. However, the question still remains. What was he doing on the roof of the tiger den when he slipped into the enclosure in the first place? His father thinks that perhaps he was searching for a way out of the zoo, but if that is the case, it is not known why he was in the zoo after closing time. To try to establish the facts, the commissioner of Bahawalpur formed a 5-member fact-finding committee. The aim of the committee was to assess the break-in, the victim's motivation, and any security flaws the zoo were responsible for. Investigators accessed the tiger den, climbing onto the roof to look for evidence. So far, nothing has been published detailing exactly what happened to the 28-year-old. Although wild tiger attacks are relatively common in neighboring India, especially in the Sundarbans, there are no wild tigers in Pakistan. But animals held in captivity around the world still pose a threat to those who work with them. Just days before Muhammad's accident, a zookeeper was mauled to death by a captive black bear over the border in India's Indira Gandhi Zoological Park when the night den doors were accidentally left open. Although Muhammad's parents still had many questions over their son's death, they did not file a lawsuit against the zoo. We may never know exactly what happened to Muhammad Bilawal, but his loss will be felt by all those who loved him. No matter how real his fate was, no one can truly imagine such a terrifying final affliction.